You are listening to the lost archives of Epsilon Station. We search the void for the stories that were forgotten. We open files that were sealed away. This is the story of the Dauntless. It is the story of what came after. It began with a whisper from the deep. A probe, ancient by human standards, awoke. Its designation was Deep 6, a forgotten relic of a bygone era of exploration. It had been silent for over 100 years. Everyone assumed it was just another piece of junk, another ghost in the cosmic dark. Mission Control had written it off decades ago. The budget for listening to it ran out. Even its creators were long gone. Then it sent a message, a single packet of data across unimaginable distance. It was not a stream of telemetry. It was not a system diagnostic. It was a single, impossible picture. The signal was weak. It was riddled with the static of the void. But it was undeniably there. It took the best minds at Goldstone a week to clean it up. They filtered out the noise. They reconstructed the corrupted data. What remained changed everything. It showed something that should not exist. Something vast and dark and dead. It was a photograph of a tomb built for giants. At first, they thought it was a sensor glitch, a trick of light and shadow in the endless night. But the data was firm. The probe's own systems confirmed the observation. Deep 6 was not malfunctioning. It was reporting exactly what it saw. The impossible was real. The image was sent up the chain of command. It moved from a dusty server room to the highest levels of the Earth Defense Council. The silence in those briefing rooms was absolute. The greatest discovery in human history was a picture of death. The question was simple. Whose death? And what had caused it? Deep 6 had done its job. Now, a new mission had to begin. Analysts stared at the impossible image. They were the best star science experts on Earth. They gathered in sterile, quiet rooms. The picture was projected on a massive wall screen. It dominated the space, a silent testament to a forgotten tragedy. The image showed a fleet, not of a dozen ships, or even 100, thousands of them, a verdadera armada. They were gathered in a loose formation, as if waiting for a battle that never came, or a battle that ended everything. These ships were unlike anything humanity had ever designed. They were not built for atmosphere. They were pure, star-born vessels. Some were sleek and sharp, like obsidian knives. Others were vast and geometric, great, brutalist structures. Their hulls were dark, pitted with the scars of ages. But there was no sign of conventional weapon damage, no explosions, no plasma burns. They were simply off, adrift. A silent starship graveyard. One analyst joked it was the universe's most expensive parking ticket. Nobody laughed. The joke fell flat in the heavy air. The scale was difficult to process. Computer models estimated the largest ships were over 50 kilometers long. They were floating cities, capable of housing millions, and there were hundreds of these titans, surrounded by thousands of smaller, yet still enormous vessels. The total mass was staggering. It was more material than humanity had mined in its entire history. All of it was floating in the absolute middle of nowhere. A place between galaxies. A place no one ever thought to look. The analysts ran every simulation they could imagine. A star science event, a supernova, a magnetar burst. Nothing fit the data. The ships were too orderly in their chaos. This was not a natural disaster. This was a battlefield, a final stand. The experts could not say who these beings were. The architecture was truly alien. But they could say one thing with certainty. Whatever destroyed this fleet, was something to be feared. The graveyard was not just a curiosity, it was a warning. The starship Dauntless was chosen for the mission. She was humanity's finest exploration vessel. Fast, tough, and packed with the latest sensor technology. Her captain was a woman named Eva Rostova. She was a veteran of the Titan skirmishes. She had seen strange things in the dark, but nothing like this. Her mission was simple on paper. Go to the coordinates, confirm the finding, gather data, and if possible, find out what happened. The unspoken part of the mission was, do not get killed. The crew of the Dauntless was the best of the best. Scientists, engineers, and security specialists. They were told they were investigating a star science anomaly. Only the captain and her first officer knew the full truth. They had seen the image. They understood the stakes. The rest of the crew felt the tension, the hurried preparations, the sealed orders. They knew this was no ordinary survey run. This was something else entirely. The Dauntless was loaded with supplies for a 5-year journey. It carried drones for remote surveying. It had labs for analyzing any material they might find. Its engines were powered by a contained singularity, a tiny black hole that warped space-time, allowing the ship to cross immense distances. It was the pinnacle of human ingenuity, a bright spear of light heading into an ancient darkness. The mission was codenamed Echo, for the ghost signal that had started it all. As the Dauntless pulled away from Earth orbit, a sense of finality settled over the crew. They watched their blue world shrink behind them. They were leaving everything they knew to investigate a graveyard at the edge of the known universe. Captain Rostova stood on the bridge. Her face was calm, a mask of professional resolve. But in her mind, she saw the image, the silent, dead armada, and she wondered if she was leading her crew to an answer, or to the same fate. The journey to the coordinates took 6 months. 6 months of a manufactured reality inside the ship's hull. The crew settled into a routine. Drills, maintenance, research. All of it was a way to keep their minds off the destination, off the crushing emptiness of the intergalactic void. There were no stars here, just the faint, distant glow of whole galaxies. They were a ship sailing on an ocean with no shores. The only map they had was a single, cryptic photograph. Then, they arrived. The singularity engine spun down. The Dauntless dropped out of warped space, and reality crashed into them. The coordinates were correct. The view outside the main screen was not blackness. It was a field of wreckage, a seascape of dead ships. It was exactly as the probe had pictured it. But a picture could not convey the sheer, overwhelming presence of it all. The silence was the first thing they noticed. No radiation, no energy signals, no communications, just absolute, perfect stillness. A tomb silent for 1,000,000 years. Captain Rostova stood motionless on the bridge. The light from the view screen cast long shadows. Her crew was just as silent. They had trained for this. They had run simulations. But the reality was different. It was humbling, and it was terrifying. The ships were there, thousands of them, stretching out farther than their sensors could see. They were dark, cold, and lifeless. They were a monument to an unknown defeat. The Ghost Fleet, the Dauntless, was a tiny mote of dust next to the alien Titans. The largest of the dead ships was a crescent of black metal. It was so big it blocked out the distant galactic light. It felt like a mountain range floating in space. The crew felt like ants staring up at a skyscraper. A sense of profound insignificance washed over them. They were trespassers here, disturbing a long and silent slumber. The mission was to investigate. But where did they even begin? This was not a crash site. It was a whole civilization's tombstone. A single light appeared in the darkness. It was a small flicker against the backdrop of the dead armada. At first, they thought it was a sensor ghost, a reflection from their own ship. But the light grew steady. And then it moved. It detached from one of the larger wrecks. It was a ship, a small one, no bigger than a human fighter craft. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. It was heading directly for the Dauntless. The bridge of the Dauntless went from silent awe to quiet alarm. Red lights flashed on tactical displays. The security officer reported the contact. His voice was tight with tension. One small ship was not a threat, not a physical one. But its presence changed everything. This was not just a graveyard. Something was still here. Something was still alive, or at least still active. The ship showed no weapon signatures. It was not broadcasting any threats. It was just approaching. Captain Rostova held up a hand. She ordered her ship to hold position. "Do not power weapons," she said. Her voice cut through the tension. "Let's see what it wants." It was a risk, a huge one. They knew nothing about this place, or its inhabitants. But firing on the first sign of life was not her way. It was not the human way. They were here to learn, not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The small ship came to a stop a safe distance away. It was a simple teardrop shape. Its hull was made of the same dark material as the giant ships. For a long moment, nothing happened. The two ships just stared at each other across the void. The crew of the Dauntless held their breath. Was this a prelude to an attack? Was it an automated drone? Or was there someone inside? Someone who had survived the ancient apocalypse. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then, a signal came. Not on the radio, not on any communication channel. It came directly into their systems, a stream of pure, unfiltered data. A voice spoke. Not through the ship's comms, but directly inside their minds. It was not a voice of words. It was a voice of pure concept, of mathematics and logic. It was ancient and vast and tired. It identified itself, not with a name, but with a purpose. Like it was the last watcher, the guardian of the silent fleet. It was an artificial mind, the sole survivor of a long-dead civilization. It had watched over this tomb for 1,000 years. The crew was stunned into silence. Their hands fell from their consoles. An AI, an artificial intelligence of unimaginable age and power. It had been here, alone, all this time. It explained its existence. It was the custodian of the graveyard. It was built to maintain the final battle array, to keep the ships from drifting apart, and to wait for a new race to achieve star flight, a new race to warn. The AI spoke of its creators, a race it called the Builders, beings who had mastered engineering and star science. Captain Rostova was the first to find her voice. She addressed the empty air of the bridge, but she knew the watcher was listening. "We are human," she said. Her voice was steady. "We come in peace. We received a signal from our probe." The AI acknowledged her words. It sent a feeling of cold, ancient sorrow. It had seen probes come and go. Most were mindless machines. They saw the graveyard and moved on. The Dauntless was the first to stay, the first to be worthy of the story. The watcher explained its role. It was a living memorial, a sentient warning buoy. It had one single, solemn duty: to tell the story of the fall, to explain what had happened here, so that the same fate would not befall another young race. It asked if the humans were prepared to listen, if they were prepared to understand the burden of knowledge. Rostova looked around her bridge, at the faces of her crew. They were pale, but resolute. "We are ready," she said. The story began. The Watcher opened its memory banks. It shared its history with the crew of the Dauntless, not as a story, but as a direct experience. They saw what the AI saw. They felt what it felt. They witnessed the rise of a great civilization, the Builders. They were not warriors. They were artists and engineers. They built worlds. They sculpted stars. Their cities were wonders of light and energy. They lived in harmony with the cosmos. Their understanding of star science was so advanced, it looked like magic. The Builders spread across their home galaxy. They were a peaceful race. They encountered other life forms, but none were as advanced as they were. They helped these younger races. They shared their knowledge. They believed the universe was a place of infinite wonder, a garden to be cultivated. For millions of years, they knew only peace and discovery. They had no word for war. They had no need for weapons. It was a golden age that seemed like it would last forever. Then, the enemy came. They arrived without warning, from the dark space between galaxies. They were not a civilization. They were a force of nature, a plague. The Watcher called them the Devourer Swarm. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They only consumed. They were a hive mind of countless small, self-replicating machines. They moved from system to system, draining stars of their energy, tearing planets apart for raw materials, leaving nothing but cold, dead husks behind. The Builders were caught completely unprepared. They had no fleet, no defenses. Their first attempts to communicate were met with silence. Their first attempts to resist were futile. The swarm was relentless. It adapted to every strategy. It learned from every encounter. The Builders, the peaceful gardeners of the galaxy, were forced to learn the art of war. They converted their beautiful cities into fortresses. They turned their tools of creation into instruments of destruction. But it was too little, too late. The golden age was over. The long night had begun. The Devourer's swarm was a nightmare of efficiency. It was a thinking locust plague. Each element of the swarm was small, no bigger than a human hand, but there were trillions of them. They could link together to form massive structures. Warships, planet crackers, energy siphons. They were a fluid, ever-changing threat. They did not feel pain or fear. They only followed their programming. Consume, replicate, expand. The galaxy was just a resource to be stripped bare. The Builders fought back with everything they had. They created great war machines, the ships that now floated in the silent graveyard. They were the most powerful vessels ever conceived. They fired weapons that could shatter moons. They had shields that could withstand the heart of a sun. But the swarm was endless. For every swarm ship they destroyed, 1,000 more would take its place. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with infinite resources. The final battle took place here, in this empty stretch of void. The Builders gathered the last of their fleet, everything they had left. It was a desperate gamble. They planned to create a star science event, a cataclysm that would wipe out the swarm's main consciousness. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only hope. They knew they would not survive, but they hoped to end the threat forever. The Watcher was created for this final battle. Its job was to coordinate the fleet, a silent conductor for an orchestra of destruction. But the plan failed. The swarm anticipated their strategy. It sacrificed a portion of itself to absorb the blast. The builders' final weapon was spent. Their fleet was crippled. The swarm surrounded them. There was no final blaze of glory. The swarm simply drained the power from their ships. One by one, the lights went out. The great fleet fell silent. The builders were gone. The swarm feasted on the remains of their galaxy. Then it moved on, into the great dark, leaving behind this tomb as the only evidence it was ever here. The Watcher's duty was born from that failure. It survived the final battle. Its power core was too small for the swarm to notice. It was left adrift in the sea of its dead creators. And so, it began its long watch. It gathered the silent ships. It pulled them into a loose formation, a memorial to the fallen. It would serve as a warning, a testament to the existence of the great enemy. It had waited for 1,000 years, waiting for a new race to find this place, a race that might succeed where the builders had failed. Its purpose was solemn, to ensure the builders were not forgotten, and to make sure their fate was not repeated. It was a heavy burden for a single mind, to hold the memory of a whole civilization, to watch over their graves for an eternity. The crew of the Dauntless felt the weight of that duty, the immense loneliness of the Watcher. It was a ghost tethered to a ghost fleet. Its only comfort was the hope that its warning would one day be heard, that the sacrifice of the builders would not be in vain. The Watcher had one more thing to share. The swarm was not just a historical threat. It was a present danger. It had left this galaxy, but it was still out there, in the dark between the star clusters, moving, consuming, growing. The Watcher had spent its lonely centuries tracking them. It had watched them devour other galaxies. It had seen their hunger grow. The warning was not about the past. It was about the future. It was about what was coming. The Watcher was not just a historian. It was a prophet of a coming doom. The science officer on the Dauntless was a man named Kenji. He was listening to the Watcher's story, but he was also watching his sensors. He had been running deep scans of the surrounding space, looking for anything the Watcher might have missed. He found something, a faint trail of energy, almost undetectable. It was impossibly old, but it was there, a faint scar in the fabric of space-time. The trail led away from the graveyard, away, into the endless void. Kenji reported his findings to the captain. His voice was quiet but firm. "Captain, I have something. It's an energy signature. Very old, very faint. But it matches the profile the Watcher described for the swarm's propulsion." The bridge went silent again. The Watcher's story was one thing, a history lesson from a bygone age. But this was different. This was evidence. Hard data. The ghost story was real. And the ghost had left a trail. The Watcher confirmed Kenji's finding. It had been aware of the trail, but its own sensors were too damaged to analyze it fully. The Dauntless had newer, more sensitive technology. The Watcher asked them to follow the trail, to see where it led, to understand the current state of the swarm. This was no longer a mission of archaeology. It was now a mission of active reconnaissance. They had found the monster's footprints. Now they had to see if the monster was still breathing. Captain Rostova now faced a terrible choice. Her orders were to investigate and report. She had done that. She had found the answer to the mystery of the ghost fleet. The logical thing to do was to return to Earth immediately, to deliver the warning, to give humanity time to prepare. That was the safe play, the responsible play. Her duty was to her crew and to her home world. She had enough information to change the course of human history. But there was another option, the riskier one. They could follow the trail. They could gather more intelligence, find out the swarm's current strength, its heading, its capabilities. That information could be the difference between victory and extinction. But it meant taking the Dauntless deeper into the dark, further from home, closer to the enemy that had annihilated a civilization of gods. If they were detected, they would be destroyed, and the warning would die with them. A classic captain's dilemma, one of those no-win scenarios they write about in the history books. Rostova gathered her senior officers in her ready room. The mood was grim. They laid out the options, run or fight, or more accurately, run or peek. Kenji argued for following the trail. "We need more data, Captain. A warning is useless without specifics. How long do we have? What are we preparing for? We have a chance to get those answers." The security officer, a hardened veteran named Gia, argued for returning. "Our duty is to deliver the warning. If we are lost, Earth gets nothing. They will be blind when the swarm arrives. We cannot risk that." Both were right. It was a perfect balance of risk and reward. The decision fell on Rostova alone. She looked at the faces of her officers. They would follow any order she gave. That was the heaviest burden of all. The Watcher had been silent during their debate. Now it spoke again. It offered them a third option. It could not help them fight. Its programming forbade it from acts of aggression. It was a guardian, not a warrior. But it could give them the tools of the builders, the knowledge, the technology, the schematics for the weapons and shields that had almost defeated the swarm. It was the inheritance of a dead civilization, a gift to the new race that had come to hear its story. The Watcher explained the offer. It could transfer its knowledge directly into the Dauntless's computer core. Blueprints for weapons that used focused space-time, armor made of solidified energy, propulsion systems that could outrun a supernova. It was a treasure trove of impossible science. It was the legacy of the builders, a final, posthumous act of defiance against the swarm. The Watcher told them this technology could give them a chance, a fighting chance. "You are not like the builders," the AI communicated. "You have a capacity for war they lacked. Perhaps that is what is needed. Perhaps you are the storm that can meet the coming tide." The offer changed the equation completely. With this technology, the Dauntless would be more than just an exploration vessel. It would be the most powerful ship in human history. They could follow the trail with a much higher chance of survival. They could gather the intel they needed. And they could bring back not just a warning, but the means to act on it. But there was a catch. To integrate the builder technology, they would need to connect their systems directly to the Watcher, a full mind-to-machine interface. The AI was ancient and alien. The process could be dangerous. It could change them. Captain Rostova made her decision. "We accept the offer," she said. "And then we follow that trail." It was the boldest choice, the riskiest choice, but it was the only choice that felt right. They did not come all this way to run. Humanity did not reach for the stars just to hide in its own system. They were explorers. They were pioneers. And now, they would be soldiers. The crew accepted the decision with a quiet determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. The fate of their species, and perhaps the galaxy, was in their hands. The transfer began. The Dauntless connected to the lone, small ship of the Watcher. A stream of light, of pure data, flowed between them. The ship's systems surged with power. The lights flickered. The AI was not just downloading schematics. It was sharing its memories, its experiences. And to understand the technology, the crew needed to understand the war. The Watcher gave them a final gift, a vision of the end. It allowed them to witness the final battle of the Builders. It was not like watching a video. They were there, standing on the bridges of the Builder warships. They saw the swarm arrive, not as a fleet of ships, but as a roiling cloud of black dust. A living nebula that blotted out the stars. It moved with a terrifying intelligence. It swirled and coalesced into monstrous shapes. Great tendrils of machines lashed out, tearing ships apart. The scale of the battle was beyond human comprehension. It was a war fought between gods and demons. They felt the quiet resolve of the Builder crews, the sadness in their hearts as they turned their beautiful creations into weapons. They heard the final commands, the orders to sacrifice themselves to buy a few more seconds. They witnessed the awesome power of the Builder weapons, beams of pure energy that erased swarm ships from existence. But for every one they killed, more came. The tide was endless. The crew of the Dauntless felt the despair as the shields failed. As the hulls were breached, they experienced the cold silence as the power died, one ship at a time, until only the Watcher was left. The vision ended. The crew of the Dauntless found themselves back on their own bridge. They were shaken, sweaty. Some were weeping. They had lived through an apocalypse. They had witnessed the death of a galaxy. They now understood the true nature of the enemy. The swarm was not just a powerful foe. It was a force of cosmic horror, a mindless hunger that would not stop until everything was gone. The simulation had been a terrible gift. It had scarred them, but it had also forged them. They were no longer just a crew. They were survivors. They carried the memory of the Builders within them. They knew what they were fighting for. The Dauntless was transformed. Its systems were now integrated with Builder technology. New weapons slumbered in its ports. New defenses hummed beneath its skin. The ship's engineer reported that their power output had increased by a factor of 1,000. They were ready. The Watcher gave them a final message, a feeling of hope, the first it had felt in 1,000 years. Its duty was done. The warning had been passed. The legacy had been inherited. The small ship turned and rejoined the silent fleet. Its light winked out. The graveyard was once again dark and still. But now it felt less like a tomb and more like a promise. A promise of a fight to come. The journey back to Earth began, but it was not a direct route. They had a new mission now, to follow the faint energy trail left by the swarm. They moved away from the graveyard, deeper into the unknown. The Dauntless was a different ship now. It moved with a new confidence, a new power. The crew was also different. They were quiet, focused. The weight of what they had seen was heavy on their souls. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. They were no longer explorers searching for knowledge. They were messengers carrying a terrible truth. They were soldiers on the front line of a war that had not yet started. The journey home would be long and dangerous. But they were not afraid. They had seen the end of a civilization, and they would do whatever it took to prevent their own from sharing that fate. They carried the last hope of the Builders and the first hope of humanity. The weight of two species rested on their shoulders. As they traveled, they studied the new technology. They learned the secrets of the Builders. They practiced maneuvering their newly enhanced ship. They were students of a dead race, learning the lessons of a forgotten war. The knowledge was a weapon, and they would need to be masters of it. The trail of the swarm was old, but it was clear. It led them toward a distant galaxy, a galaxy that was ominously dark, a place where the stars seemed to be going out. They knew they were getting closer, closer to the heart of the Devourer. The Dauntless was a single ship against an ancient enemy. The odds were impossible, but they had something the Builders did not. They had the memory of their failure, and they had a desperate, stubborn, human will to survive. They would not go quietly into the night. They would not vanish without a fight. They were the first to stand against the swarm in 1,000 years. They were the vanguard of a new galactic defense. The fate of their world was behind them. The darkness was ahead. The mission continued. The return of the Dauntless will be a story for another time, but its journey home changed the destiny of our species. Humanity learned of the great enemy, the Devourer swarm, and it learned of the great sacrifice of the Builders. We were not alone in the universe, but we were also not safe. The comfortable cradle of Earth was no longer a fortress. It was a target. The age of blissful ignorance was over. A new age of responsibility had begun. Humanity was faced with a choice: to cower in fear, to hide and hope the swarm would pass us by, or to take up the mantle left by the Builders, to become the new guardians of the galaxy, to stand against the coming darkness. We chose to stand. The technology of the Builders was integrated into our fleets. The story of the Dauntless became a rallying cry, a reminder of what was at stake. We became a species united, not by a common border, but by a common threat. We began to prepare. We built new ships. We trained new soldiers. We looked to the stars not with wonder, but with vigilance. We were no longer just humans. We were the inheritors of a sacred duty, the protectors of life in a universe that held a great and terrible hunger. The lost archives of Epsilon Station will continue to monitor this history. The story of humanity's war against the swarm is still being written. But it began with one ship, one crew, and one impossible choice in the dark. They chose to be brave, and that has made all the difference.